It seems like, again, I'm not sure what the time is. Okay, that's what I was going to say. It seems like a good time to move into questions.
So I saw someone with their hand up in the back with the awesome gloves.
Yeah.
This still relates back to the trauma discussion. Are you able to hear me? You say it to me and I'll run it up there. I'll just approach it. Okay, yeah, of course.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll run
Pass the mic up.
Are you able to hear me a little better now?
Yeah, I love your whole outfit.
Thank you.
Here you go.
Did it. All right, is this better?
Yeah.
Wow, that is very loud. This relates back to the topic of trauma, and it's a two-pronged question. One, how do you emotionally cope with writing trauma when it's drawing from your own experiences? And that can be really hard. And two, how do you portray PTSD and anything related to that, flashbacks, any of that, without it coming across as flat or gimmicky? How do you be authentic with that when you're writing?
I love both of those parts of that question. Yeah, I love both parts of that question. So the first part, like, how do I draw on my own trauma, my own experiences of trauma, and without kind of draining myself, I guess, or without like traumatizing myself? And I mean, the answer is it's complicated, and I talk about this a lot in my writing advice book, Never Say You Can't Survive. Sorry, plug. I meant to bring copies, but life got lifey. But anyway, I feel like for me, I don't so much write about my own trauma per se. Like, I don't, my writing is never that autobiographical. Like, I can point to things here and there that are kind of autobiographical. What I try to do generally, and this is a thing that I've worked at for a very long time, that's like, it's kind of a technique thing in a way. It's something I've worked on for a long time that I kind of think about. I try to be true to what the characters are going through, and I try to inhabit the characters as much as I can. But when I'm trying to actually capture the emotion and the kind of like the emotional content of something and how it feels to be experiencing a thing, that's where I draw on my own experience, but I try to portray the feeling without the context, if that makes any sense. And like just and actually I had a really good therapist who would sometimes be like, we'd be talking about stuff and she'd be like, what's going on right now? You're suddenly tensing up, you're suddenly doing this thing, and I wasn't aware I was doing it. I realized that my whole body was like changing, and I was like there was like a thing happening that I wasn't aware of. And that was actually really helpful for me as a writer, because it was like, okay, that's what it feels like when I'm thinking about traumatizing stuff, or when I'm like, there's a thing that happens where I like just go, like in my chest tightens and I'm just like, but I also, I did a ton of research, and I have a friend who's a therapist who deals with trauma. You'll notice in the 3 issues of New Mutants that I wrote, she's credited as a thank you, because I talked to her a lot for those 3 issues. I took her out to dinner and we just talked about trauma and talked about like the ways that people handle trauma and like how to write. And I wrote 3 little like sections of Martha talking about her trauma that are like prose pieces, and I ran them past my friend the therapist to get her feedback on them, because I really wanted those prose pieces to be as good as possible, because that's kind of where we're really getting into how Martha sees her trauma. And I don't know, there's a book that I really recommend called The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk, which is really good at talking about how you carry trauma in your body. And like, it's interesting for Martha because she didn't have a body until recently. And so that's interesting to be dealing with having a traumatized body when you were traumatized without a body for a long time. That's interesting. But I feel like, the other thing that was really important to me, like for the second part of the question, like, how do you depict trauma without it being pat or gimmicky, which I agree, that's a huge issue. And a bunch of things. Number one, I try really hard, and this is the thing I thought about in The City in the Middle of the Night, because there's a lot about trauma in that book. I try really hard to depict how different people handle and experience and process trauma in different ways. And if you can have multiple characters who are traumatized, who have multiple very different ways of feeling trauma and experiencing it, that goes a long way, because one of the failure modes of depicting trauma in like mass media is like everybody just is traumatized the same way. I also try to avoid some of the cliches of like people have trauma hallucinations or whatever, which, you know, I think probably does happen in real life, but I don't think it's that common. Like where like you're having flashbacks almost, and I understand on television that's a thing you do. There is actually a brief moment coming up in New Mutants, Lethal Legion, where somebody has, like, we actually depict the thing that traumatized them on the page, and it's like, we see it like kind of, and they're almost hallucinating it, but it's unclear whether they're seeing it or if it's just that they're thinking about it, because it's comics. And like, this morning we were talking by email about like, should the thing that they're seeing be a little bit more ghostly, so we understand that this random character hasn't suddenly appeared in a comic where they hadn't been there previously before. So it's a thing that we're talking about as we speak. Like, there's emails going back and forth about that right now, today. But it's, you know, I feel like not showing a one-size-fits-all version of how people deal with trauma, and also avoiding some of the cliches, is like a thing that I try to do. And just, you know, not overplaying it. Like, a lot of the times people who are traumatized are not like, they're like people who are dealing with a lot of other, you know, mental health issues. Are people with who are coping with trauma can be very, I hate to use this word, but high functioning, quote unquote. There's the vocabulary sucks around this stuff. But people you might not know if you just met them, and like, you know, being consistent. Like Martha Johansson has been in a lot of comics before I started writing her, and seemed to be like doing just fine. So I'm not going to suddenly show her, like, I feel like you have to be consistent. You have to respect the character, kind of.
Yeah. That was really powerful. Thank you.
Glad that made sense. Did that make sense? Did that answer your question? Good. Okay, great.
Anybody else?
We should win your bursting.
Oh, I just really loved that book that you wrote about writing.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you.
During 2020, when it was coming out as Tor post, I would be very grateful for it when it would show up. So thank you very, very much.
I'm so glad.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. So I wrote a writing advice book called Never Say You Can't Survive, and it's about how to get through hard times by making up stories. That's the subtitle. And it just happened to, we were serializing it online during 2020, which seemed like a good time to tell people how to cope with trauma through creativity. And now it's out as a book. And yeah, I'm so glad I'm so glad it was helpful.
Oh, I can just speak up.
Okay.
I think. So, kind of talking about like this wave of like queer media, queer characters in media. I think, especially with something like creating a character for Marvel, where there's going to be, you know, there's going to be future writers and creators involved with your work. I guess, are there things you think about in terms of like how you want to sort of put your stuff out there in a way that it stays true to itself and like cannot necessarily be co-opted, because these big corporations really like to like use queer characters and not necessarily like stay true to the spirit of what those characters represent.
Yeah, I love that question. So it's about like basically creating a character for Marvel or co-creating a character for Marvel, and then, you know, you don't really have any control over what happens to that character afterwards. And honestly, like, I mean, I chat with the other X-Men writers sometimes, and they're all super awesome, and they're all very supportive of like having more queerness, I feel like. And that makes me really happy. Like, if you're reading Captain Britain right now, that's super freaking queer. There's a bunch of those, the X-Men and X-Men adjacent comics that are very queer right now, which is really wonderful. And I feel like with Escapade, you know, I feel really blessed that I got to not just introduce her, but write her for like those 3 issues of New Mutants and now this 5-issue miniseries, so that, you know, whenever other people take her over and start writing her, they'll have a lot to go on, and I'm gonna definitely be there as a resource if anybody else is writing her and wants to ask me questions. But also, I mean, you kind of got to let go of stuff at a certain point. Like, you got to just, like, I know that, like, you know, I hope that Escapade has a long and, you know, interesting career as a character, and I hope that she keeps turning up for years, written by other people. And the price of that is that other people are going to do their own thing with her. And, you know, you just have to, like, not be too, like, precious or proprietorial about it. I mean, I hope it stays canonical that she's trans and that Morgan is trans and that transness is an important part of who they are. But I also, you know, there's other aspects of the character that I hope that they keep, like her being kind of, you know, this anti-authoritarian brat who kind of is like, likes to play pranks, but also kind of very much fools herself a lot of the time. I don't know. I mean, I hope that I feel like you get one. You either get to have her keep appearing in a lot of comics, or you get to kind of keep tight control over the character. You don't get both. And so I'm really hoping that she keeps appearing in other places and that people keep getting to read about her, because that would really make me happy. And I'm not going to be, like, I don't know, anytime you're doing something, A, collaborative, and B, that you don't own, you have to just kind of be a little bit like, okay, I'm letting go, and you can't be too precious about it, I feel like. I really hope that the queerness of Escapade is something that's honored, and I hope, you know, that she gets to keep having the relationships that she has now. But I don't know, we'll see. I really hope so.
Excellent. Anybody else?
I know you've mentioned you've been a fan of the X-Men for a long time, but like moving from just a fan to a writer, what was the research process like for like moving into this existing IP that has a very rich history and like all these characters that other people have created? What was that process of like learning how to write existing characters like?
It was terrifying. No, I'm serious. It was freaking terrifying. Like, I read an interview recently with Dan Slott, who he said that he was coming off. So Dan Slott had this like really big kind of epic run on Spider-Man for like, I want to say 10 years, maybe even longer. He took over Spider-Man right after Satan and old Spider-Man's marriage. Real thing that happened. Satan and old Spider-Man's marriage. Look it up. And so Dan Slott took over right after Satan and old Spider-Man's marriage. I just love saying that. And they wrote it through the part where like Spider-Man was secretly Dr. Octopus and out the other end, and like all this bonkers stuff. Anyway, so Dan Slott came off of this really long run on Spider-Man, and Marvel came to him and said, hey, so do you want to write the X-Men next? And he was like, no. Dan Slott was like, no, the X-Men are too confusing. There's too much. There's too many characters. There's too much backstory. I can't understand it. I'm sorry. And so he took over Fantastic Four instead, which there's only 4 of them. It's right there in the name. I mean, there's more than 4 of them because there's the She-Hulk's been in the Fantastic Four, and like, I don't know. There's a few other characters, but Fantastic Four, it's like, it's pretty easy to understand. And so, you know, I read that interview and I was like, yes, I very much relate to what Dan Slott is saying here. It is terrifying, and I still have this thing where I get a lot of imposter syndrome dealing with X-Men stuff, and I'll be reading X-Men comics and I'll be like, I vaguely know who this character is, but I feel like I should know who they are, and then I'll go look at the Wikipedia or whatever, and it's like this, like an entry as long as your arm with like, then they were a zombie, then they were a cyborg, then they were briefly like a god, but then they became just a demigod, and then they became a giant squid, and now they're just back to there. And like, how do you keep track of all this? It's ridiculous. And so it's really intimidating, and I'm lucky that the X-Men folks have been very patient with me, but also I just basically did a really deep dive and I bought like a giant like hardcover of like the first like few years of New Mutants from back in the 80s and just read that. I read a bunch of other New Mutants. I read like a ton of New Mutants going back to like 20 years ago. I read, for Karma, I actually went and read Marjorie Liu was writing Astonishing X-Men for a while, and she did a lot with Karma, so that was really fun to read like her take on Karma. That was actually really freaking terrific. But there was a lot, and like